Hi everyone! We're continuing our series on Peter, who was a fisherman turned disciple. Last week we talked about the moment when Peter saw Jesus walking on water and how Peter struggled with the shadow of doubt. Today we're going to read from the book of Luke chapter 22. We're going to learn about another shadow that Peter dealt with and how Jesus continued to love Peter regardless of Peter's shadow. Now, before we dive into Luke 22, let's rewind our story to the point when Jesus was being arrested before his crucifixion. While Jesus was being arrested, Peter became so upset that he took a sword and cut off an ear from a servant of a high priest. Jesus does not approve of responding to violence with violence, so he responds to his disciples by saying, "No more of this." Then Jesus does the unthinkable. He heals the man by placing his ear back on his head as if it was never cut off. Now imagine someone persecuting you and treating you poorly. Instead of reacting in a harmful way, you instead demonstrate self-control and compassion. I don't know about you, but I would struggle with responding with self-control in that situation. As the Roman officer took Jesus away, we find Peter following them, but from a distance. We also find that Peter is showing his loyalty to Jesus by following him. Peter knew very well that following Jesus could result in his own death. As the officers and Jesus reached the courtyard, Peter spotted people who started a fire in the middle of the courtyard. So Peter sits down with the people near the fire. In verse 56, it says, "A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, 'This man was with him.'" How do you think Peter responds to the servant girl? Well, up to this point, Peter displayed loyalty to Jesus. But unfortunately, Peter breaks his loyalty to Jesus by denying that he even knew Jesus. Sometime later, someone else spots Peter in the crowd and says, "You are also one of them," meaning that Peter was also one of those who followed Jesus. Now, how do you think Peter responded? He denied Jesus a second time. He even told the woman that he doesn't even know Jesus. And then an hour later, a man yells out to Peter and says, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Verses 60 through 61 say that Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned to him and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word that the Lord Jesus had spoken to him prior to this day. He said, "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. Realizing how disloyal he had become to Jesus, Peter left the courtyard weeping and ashamed. Now, this story illustrates that Peter struggled with his loyalty to Jesus. He did desire a life of loyalty to Jesus, but fear overcame his loyalty. Remember, Peter knew there was a high chance that he could be persecuted and killed for even identifying himself as a follower of Jesus. The fear of death was too much for Peter to bear. But the interesting point of this whole story is this: Jesus will always be loyal to us. He will always love us. And he already knows when we will mess up in our lives before we even mess up. He knew Peter would deny him, but Jesus continued to love Peter. And do you remember the Roman officers and the priest servant during Jesus' arrest? Jesus showed compassion to them even as they were arresting him. Despite Peter's shadows, Jesus never asked him to leave the group. Instead, Jesus continued to teach Peter and prepare him for God's bigger plan. And the same goes for us. Even though we may struggle in our faith and wrestle with shadows in our lives, Jesus continues to chase after us. He wants us to lock our eyes to him, to go to him. He has a plan for us despite our messy lives. He loves us and will always remain loyal to us by pursuing us. To continue the conversation of this story at home, be sure you click on the discussion and activity sheet below, which includes a fun family activity. We've also supplied a link to the Bible story in case you want to read it again with your family. Hope you have a blessed week, everyone.